sure Bernard Moffatt wouldn't mind me saying that he's seen many iterations of government and Tynwald come and go. He's still a regular contributor to political debate on social media and continues as Assistant General Secretary of the Celtic League. With the Canada administration about to embark on some fairly radical changes, Bernard gives his seasoned view on population growth, social media's influence on political debate and much, much more. While he styles himself as the cuddly old grandad of Manx politics, watch out for his false teeth. They can still inflict a nasty bite. I began by asking Bernard whether he thinks this latest population drive will work.
Well, I started in politics, if you want to put it that way, in Moffatt when it was formed. And at that time, the population was about 47,000 on the island. So I've seen a bit of population growth in that time. But the interesting thing about this is it's a case of we've been here before. Periodically, governments try to bolster the population. They did in the 70s and they did in the 80s as well. And it seems to build up problems more than it resolves them. I know there's a demographic and guys like that fellow who used to go on about population Crane, who seems to have shut up a bit now. He's got in the
he's still leading a committee into it. So.
Yeah, no, they're all leading committees. But no, the thing about it is I don't see and hear a great deal of enthusiasm for population growth. A lot of people are against it. And I suppose the downside of that is there's a downer on development generally. And where we could do with getting development, like for social housing, to deal with the homeless problem on the island and the inability of young people to source housing now, which is forcing them to leave the island. The negative from population growth mitigates against that. So I don't think it's very well thought through at all. And as with a lot of the policies of the new government, the Cannon government, I think they're clutching around all the time for something to catch the eye when in actual fact there doesn't seem to be much substance. I know there's always this the Alan Bell syndrome, if I can put it that way. Alan Bell famously said the present government is always worse than the last one, but in this case I think there's a grain of truth in relation to that, because not that it's particularly not well endowed with people who could do a good job if they got down to it. It's because it's always looking for initiatives, sound bites, anything at all to detract from actually addressing the issues that are around.
One of the perhaps popular things that this government has done over the course of the last 12 months, and whether the government has done it, whether there have been backroom deals, whether there's been certain encouragements, but a very significant portion of the senior civil servants have suddenly found a desire to spend time in their gardens over the course of the last 12 months. Now, it's often said by the Manx public that the civil servants run the government. Is this an attempt, do you think, that from government to finally say, actually, we're going to be in charge here, if you're not jumping to our tune out the door?
I wish your dewy-eyed view of the future was likely to come true. No, I don't, and I don't necessarily think it's a bad thing to have competent civil servants. I, as a union official, dealt with chief executives who were incredibly good at the job they did and very positive in the way that they dealt with matters. So I haven't got a downer on the civil service. I think it's probably too big, and I think given certainly advances in technology and the way that people work and are willing to work, it could be smaller. It certainly shouldn't be leading the government by the nose, but it should be providing them with a decent degree of guidance. Now, I think in relation to the Cannon administration, and that was perhaps best shown by the fact that he dragged the fella who was with him in Treasury into the Chief Secretary's job. Alf hasn't got confidence in himself. He's got to have people around him that he feels comfortable with, and whether they're the right people for the job or not, I don't know, but that certainly indicates that the civil service probably have got more, senior civil service, have probably got more say than they should have. But having said that, when you read particularly on social media people slagging off the civil service, let's be perfectly honest, and you know this from the time you were an MHK and minister yourself and member of departments, the whole system would fall down if we didn't have a decent public service. And I think we've got a very good public service, but I ascribe to the view of the late Noel Kringle, former president of Tynwald, who something like 25 years ago said we should address the numbers of civil servants and certainly stop it growing like Topsy, which it had tended to do for some time.
And one of the problems, well, part of the problem in relation to the whole of the way in which government operates, the processes of government, we may start to hear from the Chief Minister, because he's due to make a statement in October in relation to the structure of the civil service. But isn't part of the problem that this government has in that it has effectively got rid of so many chief executives over the course of the last 12 months, or they have departed for whatever reason? There's an awful lot of people in temporary roles now acting up as chief executive. As you, I think, rightly said, you need good, strong civil servants.
Yeah, well, it's not good at all.
To help. So this government does seem to have quite a lot of ambition in terms of big policy ideas, but there's nobody there to actually help them deliver.
Yeah, you can't have people temporarily acting up. You need to bite the bullet, and if they can do the job, give it to them. My heart sinks into my boots when you say things like the Chief Minister's going to make a statement, because I really do wish that the Chief Minister would shut up for a bit and just stand back and look at the situation and try and weigh up the problems that the island has. He's forever coming out with initiatives. They created this Our Island plan, whereas, as you're well aware, there's been innumerable plans over the years from every government that comes in. They've come up with the other initiative to go out and not just grow the population, but also grow industry. So the Chief Minister thinks it's his role to trail halfway around the world doing this. I do think that people want a government, and I think this has got the making of a competent government. I certainly had a lot of confidence in it when it was first set up. But people want it to sit back, look at the problems and resolve the problems here. And I'm afraid they're not doing that. Continually blathering on about the fact that they're developing the old nurses' home for housing doesn't address the real housing deficit that, incidentally, I was writing to you and later Chris Thomas on when you were in the House of Keys and when you were a minister. It was an issue back then. It's a much bigger issue now, and they need to be sort of looking at that and finding innovative ways to use the existing social housing stock, and also, grow that estate as well. They won't do that if, going back to what I said earlier, people's ideas about development are polarised on the island, and that's what the Chief Minister is doing. He's polarising.
And part of the solution that we are told, and indeed every time I've asked the question how many greenfield site houses are going to have to be built to meet the 15,000 population, it's fair to say that ministers bristle at the question. the implication from what they say is that most of the development will happen in brownfield sites. So large office blocks that are no longer used as office blocks potentially will be converted into housing. Do you think it's possible to house 15,000 people in brownfield sites?
I would doubt it. There's undoubtedly a lot of underused land, particularly in the east of the island here, in the conurbation that's already built up. You're not talking about 15,000 houses, of course. You're talking about families coming in. So I don't know what 5,000-6,000 dwellings would be needed. But you've also got to try and hang on to the population you've got here, the younger population, and you do see and read on social media quite frequently about younger people who are leaving the island, not just for job opportunities, because they'll always do that, and good luck to them, but because they just think there's no future here, there's no foot on the housing ladder, or even affordable rental accommodation. It's I was quite amused. I was always looking at vague things on the internet, and I noticed this morning I was looking something about the cost of living here and elsewhere, that it's 50% cheaper to live here than in New York. One of these vague internet things,
right, yeah.
Obviously. But I thought, well, we'll have all the young people staying here. They won't want to go to New York. I don't think that's going to happen.
No, it's unlikely. But I mean, to be fair on this government, what they've identified.
Fair to government. You've got the wrong fellow in here.
Well, I'll give government's line, and then you can knock it down if you choose. What government's trying to achieve is to boost the economy, to ensure that we have strong public services, that we will have the funding to come in to fund these the public services. And one of the obvious ways of doing that is expanding the economy. And what we know at the moment is that there aren't enough people to fill most of the jobs that are being made available. Now, yes, we're not starting from a wonderful place in that there's a housing problem. It was described as a housing crisis in the last election. And there doesn't seem, despite Chris Thomas's bold statements to the contrary, doesn't seem to be a huge change over the last 12 months with regard to that.
Chris has the progress of a sloth when it comes to housing, I'm bound to say. I like Chris, by the way. I don't dislike any of them personally at all. Politically, I can disagree with people, but if you get to the stage where you actually have a sort of visceral dislike for them, we're going into some of the darker corners of social media where people do lose the plot a bit. But I don't see a great deal of progress from them at all, and that's why I say it's always sound bites, and they're always well-intentioned.
But then isn't this what you were saying in the first place, that they actually, instead of coming forward and knee-jerk policies, that they perhaps over the course of the last 12 months, and I've criticised them for this, not actually apparently delivering much in 12 months, maybe they are sitting back and looking and seriously considering what the policy options are. Maybe that's what's happening.
Well, hang on, let's not get sort of tangled up in this 12-month thing. We're talking here about a chief minister who, after the former chief minister, was the most senior figure in the previous administration. Now, he was running the Treasury for all that administration, and he's gone on then seamlessly to be chief minister. This is a guy who should have hit the ground running, and indeed I thought he would do. I know I take the mickey out of him on social media, but there's one thing what you say in social media, another what you think, and I thought, as I think a lot of other people did, there's a good chance here we'll get a breath of fresh air. Now, okay, 12 months, so there's still a few years for him to come into his own, but he's got to start moving shortly. And I don't think some of the initiatives that have been put forward are going to be good for him from the point of view of doing him justice, and I don't think they'll do much for the island. Because honestly, Donald Gelling went to the Gulf years ago, and I don't know what Alpha's expecting to find out in South Africa. I know we've got a big expat South African community here. Good on them, they contribute to the island. But I don't think the island's going to develop great links with South Africa, and certainly it's not going to develop great links with the likes of Bahrain and so on. The other difficulty for folk like the Chief Minister, and indeed the other dependencies, when they go to these countries to set out their stall, they're arriving as people who are sort of deputies in a colonised administration. You know, they're sitting down with people who are the heads or senior figures in sovereign states, and they're looking across the table at somebody like Alf, or somebody from, doesn't have to be him, somebody from Jersey or Guernsey, and thinking these people get their remit from a unelected governor that's put in over them. Now, that's not a confidence building sort of position to start from. So on that basis alone, and on more practical issues, I don't think there'll be a great deal of benefit from these jaunts around the globe. But if, you know, that's what rocks his boat, he should go off and do it. I think he could do much more and do a much better job here addressing some of the issues that people want him to get a grip of.
Well, lots more to talk about after the break. You're listening to Perspective with political commentator Bernard Moffatt. So in relation then, I mean, you've talked a lot about social media, lots of references to this. You obviously follow it a lot. You obviously post a lot.
Yeah.
Is social media, has that sort of taken over from conventional forms of political debate, and is that a good thing?
There's certainly nothing wrong with it, and I certainly, you know, forget the advent of Facebook and Twitter and so on. Back in the days of the forum, Manx forums, which is still there, it's still going, and it's really quite entertaining. It's usually ripping the back out of me and you anyway. But back then, I think one of the MLCs, can't think of his name now, wanted it to be cracked down on. I don't think there's any need for social media to be cracked down on, but I think social media's got to be responsible in the way it acts as well. I mean, you said I post a fair lot. I do. I post on Celtic League site, the Celtic League Manning site, which is the Manx one, and I also have my own personal page as well. I always post what I think, and I put my name to it. I think there's a danger with some of certainly the interactive social media sites, that they can be stoked up to pursue an agenda against the government, and it appears to be coming from one source when it's not. It's really being generated by disaffected MHKs, MLCs who ingratiate themselves in with some social media platforms, and I don't think that's a good thing. I think it's important for social media to exist, and there's no doubt it'll continue to develop, but it's got to always be accountable. And certainly if anybody flags up to me that they're not happy about something, I generally have a look at it and discuss it with them, and even in some instances would remove a post if it was causing people genuine hurt, as opposed to a situation where you're making political comment on something, if you like. And I don't like the idea of social media being used. I like it to be open. I'm not against the idea of anonymity, which is the major forte of platforms like Manx forums, because it's really quite amusing. It's more of got a private eye bent about it, and some of the comments are quite humorous, particularly when a strand will start, and by about 3 pages into it, it changed completely, and they've gone off on a tangent, and it can be really funny, even if they're giving you and me a good kicking on the way.
So then, In terms of, I mean, you sort of mildly rebuking there some Tynwald members for not perhaps engaging in the forum that they should, which is of course Tynwald. I mean, we heard one of the great revelations over the course of this last 12 months have been the secret Tynwald briefings. Which, of course, have happened for as long as Tynwald's existed. I mean, the secret element, of course, of this was that the clerk of Tynwald office refused to say what the briefings were about, and I think in a democracy, probably that's not a reasonable stance to take. However, that's by the by.
No, I think you're touching on a really interesting point there, and it's one you could perhaps explore in more detail with much more knowledgeable people than me, particularly politicians. I think one of the great problems for Tynwald and the Keys is it's so hidebound. It's locked in, I don't know, it's not really fair to say 60 years ago, because it's more like 100 years ago. And I think if Tynwald and the Keys in particular was more modern in its approach, you would get MHKs being more outspoken instead of using back channels, if you like, to develop any agendas they've got. The other thing is that, of course, it's a single club, the way that government is constructed in the Isle of Man. So unless you want to be rebel, like I ran into one going out of the station as I was coming in, Peter Carron. Unless you want to be like Peter, who was prepared to, put his neck on the block and did quite frequently, you're going to go with the swim. And I think in this current House of Keys, most of them want to swim along, and if they want to float out any mischief or bad ideas, they'll hijack social media or some other means to do it, And I don't think that's a good thing. I think Tynwald needs to modernise its procedures, but God, I'm in my mid-70s now, so I'm coming to the stage where I couldn't really care.
But one of the things that Tynwald did, and presumably with a view to deliver the result that you're talking about, was to change the payment system, because effectively, what Peter Carron used to talk about very frequently was anyone who worked for a government department was getting a large financial incentive to be part of government. It's no longer the case. So none of the department members who don't hold other positions like minister or chair, none of them get any extra incentive. So they could reasonably all have migrated to the knockabout opposition.
Could I have a tissue here? Because the tears running down my cheeks are soaking the floor. The position is that politics is well rewarded in the Isle of Man. They might not think so, but really for what they're doing, it's well rewarded. And you have to ask yourself, did we have a better political system when the reward wasn't as good as it is now? I take your point that the whole business of giving plusages for departments or for ministers and so on would skew the system, and probably did to a certain extent. But even with the so-called modified system, it's a good system. And what happened to the ethos of public service? I mean, when I was working in the union, periodically you would get approached to do stuff out with your trade union duties, sometimes from the Isle of Man government. I mean, I sat on committees, various committees, won't go into which ones, but quite a few for the Isle of Man government. You never got a cent for it. You did it because it was part of the ethos of public service. And I know employers as well who did exactly the same. So there's I'm going to say now something that will become, there was a great sense of community in the island. I don't think we've got that sense of community now, and we're certainly not going to get a sense of community by loading the wage packets of MHKs and MLCs. I think they're very well paid for what they do, and if they don't like it, they can resign and use their talents at the level they think they'll be remunerated in some other area.
And of course,
they're quick enough to tell somebody who's criticising them to stand for the keys. My answer when they moan about pay is give up your job and go and work somewhere else. You won't see many of them walking out the door.
Indeed. Now, one of the remaining strong incentives for people to effectively toe the party line is the fact, in my view, and I think it's a view shared by a number of people, something like 60, maybe 70%, maybe even more than that, of the power, in political power in the island is vested in the hands of the Council of Ministers. So becoming a minister, if you really do want to change the political world on the Isle of Man, you really do need to get into the Council of Ministers, unless the current system changes. Lord Lisfane came forward with a series of proposals which would potentially have addressed that
Lord,
issue.
the service from wise men from across the sea, but, particularly in that direction.
But no change was made. No significant change was made, and we continue really with this position where Council of Ministers, the 9 members of Council of Ministers, hold significantly more power than the remaining. How many would there be left? 24 members of Tynwald.
Yeah, but I mean, they could modify their role, and periodically over the years they have. I mean, certain ministers have been allowed to digress on issues which in previous administrations they'd have been expected to toe the line on. I think one of the problems you've got with the current Council of Ministers is it seems to me to be a group of individuals, whereas some of the former Council of Ministers, and particularly the early ones, were actually like a cabinet. I mean, I don't know, do you remember, because you were yourself a member of Moffatt back then, but there was great debate in Moffatt back when the Comyn system came in, and as was often the case back in those days, because you used to be shouting at me, I remember quite frequently, I supported the Council of Ministers system, and a lot of people didn't support it at all. I think it was a good idea. I've always thought the Walker administration in particular was particularly sound in the way it worked. Obviously, they're chalk and cheese to me politically, the people in those days. People like David Cannon, who was Treasury Minister, and the late David Cannon, Alfstad, and Walker. But the team seemed to work together. When I look at the current situation of Chris, Julie, Hooper, Allinson and so on, I think these are people all paddle in their own canoe. I don't see any cohesion. I don't see Alf sort of keeping the lanket on them, to put it in a parlance you might follow from the agricultural sector. But that's what's needed. I don't see anything wrong with the Council of Ministers, and I think it should function as a government. You bring me round to a point now which you probably weren't going to raise, but I'll raise. I do think that the function of the Council of Ministers, and the Chief Minister in particular, is to deliver bad news now and again. And particularly with the cost of living the way it is, and the fact that everybody, the world and his wife, is shouting that they are a special case and they should receive support. The Chief Minister and the Council of Ministers should, in that situation, be willing to stand up and give people and give sections of the community bad news and say, look, you're not going to like hearing this, but this is the reality of the situation. Now, instead of that, they're shirking their responsibilities and they're kicking the can down the road, as I described it, particularly as they did recently over the electricity cap. They haven't given anybody cheap electricity. They just kicked the cost of it down the road, and it'll have to be picked up eventually. And that can be translated across to a number of situations with the government. I think the Chief Minister has got to be willing to stand up in that House of Keys in Tynwald on occasion and say, look, I'm running the show here. You're not going to like this. news that I'm giving you, but this is it. I'll give you the unpalatable news. You can all go off and play buttering up your constituents. I'm looking after the people of the Isle of Man. And he would then engender in members of the House of Keys a feeling that they're there to look after all the people of the Isle of Man, not just look after a constituency base, which some of them seem to indicate at the present time, and that's why they scurry off to social media to try and do a bit of stirring behind the scenes.
Now, by this stage, several people will be throwing Yorkshire puddings at the radio, saying that bloomin' Moffatt trying to get rid of our capped electricity price. But perhaps it's not as widely known.
I'm enjoying it.
Well, perhaps it's not as widely known. Maybe it should be that there's certainly tens of million, maybe 30, 40 million pounds worth of a gap so far in the calculation of how the tax cap is going to be the electricity cap is going to be afforded. There's talk of a £26 million loan, but the difference between this year and last year is something like £105 million. Now, some of that will have been covered by the price that's already been added to the electricity bill. But we're still, rough calculations, 30, 40 million pounds that hasn't been identified. And ultimately, we'll end up having to pay that back through taxation.
Well, you hit the nail on the head when you said the loan, because that's what it is. And loans need to be paid back. So people who say, as you said, are throwing their shoes at the radio because I'm going on about the electricity cap. The cap is there because there's a loan being given to the MUA. If the government had gone to the reserves and taken money from them and said it's going to be capped and there'll be no charge on you, at least they'd been honest. The Chief Minister should have set out that there's going to be a cost further down the line for the community for this and any other moves that are made. I'm all for intervention. I want them to assist people who are really struggling at the present time. And I think most people on the island would go along with that. But you listen to a whole range of MHKs and they're shouting for interest groups from business to agriculture, everybody. And you just can't buy your way out of a cost of living crisis, which is what the Isle of Man government is hoping to gull people into thinking that it's going to do. It can't be done.
And yet every other government in all the surrounding areas of the island are doing similar things.
Yes, but you're comparing apples with oranges here. If you look at the United Kingdom, for example, or indeed the Republic of Ireland, 26 counties, they're carrying substantial national debt. We don't carry national debt. Now, I'll give you another, for instance. If people years ago hadn't been so negative about the idea of the Isle of Man being independent and being its own country, today it would be an independent country. Alf could rock up in Bahrain as the leader of an independent country. It could also raise national debt in the way that other governments around the world do. But it's not a sovereign government in that sense. It can borrow, and they are borrowing and have borrowed in recent years, but it can't match the fiscal levers that are being used elsewhere. They try to explain things to people on the island simply, when in actual fact, if they were just a little bit more complex about how they explained, they might be surprised that people would be able to take it in. I don't think Manx people are stupid, or Isle of Man residents are stupid. I think they would understand if the message from government was clear, coherent, and actually set out what was going on. At the moment, they're all over the place.
So you've raised
too many things.
Surprised that we've got as far as 35 minutes into the show, and you've this is the first time you've suggested that maybe independence might have been a good idea. Why do you think that government, despite we want apparently as Isle of Man government to have all the trappings of an independent government, but aren't prepared to just go that extra step. Why do you think that is?
Well, public mood as well. I think they know that the public mood is not for independence. It's never bothered me. I mean, I've been a nationalist since the Nationalist Party was set up in the 60s, so I've at least I'm consistent, if you like. And I'll probably die an unhappy man because the island will still be subordinate to the United Kingdom, which is effectively what it is now. But it misses so many opportunities from that situation, and it's pointless trying to persuade people who are diametrically opposed to it, because they've just got this idea into their head that it'll always be a bad thing. And you can quote examples of other countries, much smaller countries, ones with a much lower GDP than we have, that haven't got the advantages we've got of stability, of despite our criticisms of it, a well-honed political system, a well-constructed civil service, a good private sector. All these things are pluses, if you like, towards an independent Isle of Man, but it's just the way people are, and I'm not going to knock me brains out for the few years I've got left.
and do you think? I mean, because there's a united Ireland, whereas perhaps would have been considered unthinkable even a generation ago. It's becoming much more. It's not unreasonable to think about it as a prospect. Scotland's independence. I mean, certainly if they could hold an independence referendum this week, there's no doubt that Scotland would become independent. Do you think any of these things are actually going to happen? And if they did, is that the time for the Isle of Man to start thinking about this?
Well, you're broadening things out now, but certainly in relation to a 32-county island, I don't think that will happen in the immediate future. There's still a lot of legacy from the Troubles period. I think there's more cohesion in the island of Ireland than there's ever been. And I mean, I've got an interest there. I've got 2 kids and grandkids over there and everything. So I want it to work. The system at the present time is working well, and the cooperation between them is good. And I think there'll be an inevitable drift towards some sort of cohesion. Scotland's a more interesting one, because I think, as you say, if they had a referendum, probably Scotland would go for independence this time. But I see a change anyway in the whole emphasis which the Good Friday Agreement led to, which was the idea of cooperation, not just between England and the Celtic countries, but between England, the Celtic countries, including the Isle of Man, and the other dependencies. And I think that's a good thing. And it's a shame that they hadn't gone for a more federated system, because I think people probably here, rather than full-blown independence, could live with some federated solution. But that's for younger heads than me to come up with. And they'd still probably want to keep a governor.
Yes, and on that topic, because, of course, as you know, about a month ago, we had a wonderful programme planned, which you were supposed to be coming on to. But unfortunately, the passing of the Queen of Man, if Peter Cannell was the Queen of Man, according to Peter Cannell, and apparently the late Deemster Kane. But anyway, that's by the by. I asked, would you be prepared to come on the programme and say something suitably sombre and respectful, and you declined at that stage. I mean, there is a.
I can't remember you asking me, actually.
There's a sort of serious point behind this, and that is that during that long period of mourning, there was perhaps a minority of the island's population, but a significant minority, just don't really get the whole monarchy thing. Do you think it was right? The way things were handled was correct?
No, I think probably it was drawn out a bit. I don't think anybody can be happy about the fact that somebody's died, and particularly if you have, as you had in this case, somebody who'd been head of a country and indeed had been Lord of Man, I'll call that here, for many years. I mean, I met the Queen years ago in 1953 when she did a tour around. I was waving me Union Jack.
Marvellous.
As it happens.
Have you got a picture?
I'll have a look. I'm rooting out all pictures at the moment, but I'm sure somebody will find one off me anyway. But no, I wouldn't be negative in that respect at all. I think it went on a bit too long, and people got angry about that. I don't know how the island, I mean, moving on from that, how the island will lean towards the new royal setup, if I can put it that way. I noticed that another thing, one of the great benefits of being retired is you lie around aimlessly in the morning drinking tea and scanning the internet. I noticed that the Danish royal family are downsizing or something, and that there's a great debate now about whether the UK should do that as well. But I think there's going to be changes in relation to that. And certainly, I think, leaving aside the royal aspect of it and everything, I think it's the time for change in the Isle of Man over the Lieutenant Governor. It's nice enough old codger. They always are. I mean, I've been up to Government House myself and had a spot of lunch there and managed to work out which knife and fork to use many years ago. But in this day and age, the island should have its own head of state, even if that person were called by some other title than governor. I think there was a proposal some years ago, but again, the late David Cannon got very uptight about it, and it was voted down. But
yes, I think it was the Lord's Lieutenant, I think, was suggested.
Yeah, and I think there was an idea that it could be a natural, because obviously people always compare it with whoever's president of Tynwald, and you know, to be fair, we've had some hugely impressive presidents of Tynwald. I'll really get people throwing things at the radio now. I think Charlie Carrouche was an excellent politician. I think the late Noel Kringle was as well. So I haven't got anything against presidents of Tynwald, but I think the idea at the time was it would be a natural progression for somebody like a Deemster. You know, there's a lot of respect years ago for Deemsters. I don't know, is there that sort of respect now? I think some of the old certainties, Phil, he said nostalgically, are going out of our life on this island. And certainly the sense of community that was here, I don't think is here now. You've only got to look at the amount of organisations. I was talking to a lady only last night, actually, who's desperately trying to keep a very positive organisation going in the west of the island, which benefits families, young people, everybody, and they can't get a committee together to run it, and the people who are running it are now getting very old, you know. So there's not the sense of community there was years ago.
And of course, going back to what we were talking about earlier about social media, that's where the new community is. But you can't hold jumble sales on social media. Well, I suppose you can in a certain way, but it's a different sort of thing, and people seem happy to engage with society through their laptops, but are less eager to actually go out and sit on a committee. And I suppose some of that's down to government introducing all these new regulations.
Let's stick with a comfort zone closer to us, Manx culture. I don't think culture Vannon has benefited the Manx cultural scene. Of course, it has been a benefit in that it's become a focus for a lot of research, a lot of archival work, and it promotes regularly the festivals, the Manx events on the island. But what's gone away from it was, you know very well, back in the 70s and 80s, there was a lot of spontaneous work with individuals and societies generally. Now, It's not Culture Vannon's fault. Everybody's just looked and said, oh, the government set up Culture Vannon. We don't need to do that sort of thing now. There are people still doing things, of course, but not in the way that they were and not as innovatively as they were doing. But perhaps that's just me with the fog of age over my eyes.
And maybe, well,
I'll get back to the photographs and see can I did find one of your good lady recently. I'll see can I find one of you.
In terms then, I mean, you were talking about Culture Vannon there. I mean, I think many people engaged with Manx culture would say very strongly that Culture Vannon does an excellent job.
Oh, I do myself. I always qualify. I always criticise something and then qualify it by praising it.
But of course, what your example is a great example. This is what's happening across society, and actually one of the few good things to come out of COVID was people started to re-engage with community in ways that they perhaps hadn't done before. We were moving away into this sort of governmental runs society for
dead
us.
On. That's a really good example. Excellent example.
Given the opportunity, people were keen to do that. So is it perhaps that we just need to find ways in which we can re-engage people?
Well, absolutely. I think the COVID situation was excellent. It wasn't just groups, it was individual support. I mean, perish the thought I had people knocking on my door saying, can we help you out, as I looked at them askance, having hardly spoken to the neighbours for years. But I think that's part of it. And the other interesting thing about that time was the government suddenly discovered, because it had to, that it could think outside the box. Now, why can't it do that at the present time with the issues it's got currently? And I take myself right back to where I began in this interview, if you make that the start, and that's, why doesn't the government just sit back and look at the problems and try and decide how it's going to tackle them, instead of coming out with a soundbite, an initiative here, a trip there, or whatever? They really are not thinking it through. And if they applied that COVID-style logic that was applied then, when suddenly people could work from home, the way people got deliveries of food, the way essential services were maintained, it was all within a matter of weeks put in place. And although it had some hiccups and there were some unfortunate events, not least the return of people to the island at the very beginning who'd been overseas, and that was a bit botched. And for the most part, it was a success. It was a success story for the community. Whether it continued to be, I don't know, but it just showed that given half a chance, there is a sense of community here that would come out.
And as we approach the end of the programme, in 4 years' time, we'll be talking about the new government, which will have just been elected, all things being as they should be.
Probably in 4 years' time, you'll be talking to me in Peel Cemetery.
But I mean, is there hope, do you think, for the next 4 years?
To the sound of cheering, no doubt. I think there's always hope, if you like. As I said before, it's 12 months into this government. It should have got its running shoes on, not least because there was traction from the previous administration. It's still got time to prove itself. And I would imagine, given how impatient people are, and this was shown at the last election, and also the developments of social media and its ability to influence things, if MHKs, let alone the Council of Ministers or the Chief Minister, but if MHKs don't get their act together individually and make the system work, they will be able to go on to one of those jobs that will pay them a lot more than the one they've got now. I'll be there cheering them on. I'll help them write their CV.
That was political commentator Bernard Moffatt. Over his many years as union leader and political activist, there's little in politics that he hasn't seen. But is he stuck in the past, or do you think he has a point? There's certainly plenty of challenges ahead and potentially big changes being proposed by the Cannon government. But is the Chief Minister up to Bernard Moffatt's challenge and prepared to be bold enough to stand against public opinion in trying to deliver his government's new agenda? I hope you enjoyed the programme, which will be available soon as a podcast from Manx Radio's website. But for now, I'm Phil Gorn. Got a Mayus and Geistach Rum. Thanks for listening.